A pirate captain held less absolute power than the captain of a merchant vessel. The image of a tyrant with a parrot on his shoulder, ruling single-handedly with an iron fist, shatters upon contact with the facts. If the captain wasn't a dictator, then who ran a ship full of murderers and thieves? How did this band of anarchists not destroy itself in a struggle for power and plunder? Here lies the central question. How did outcasts who rejected all of society's laws manage to create and brutally enforce their own democratic codes? Codes that were often fairer than the laws of the Royal Navy. A captain like Bartholomew Roberts could be removed by his crew of 150 cutthroats with a simple majority vote. This was a level of accountability unthinkable for a naval captain, and the secret to this system breaks every stereotype about pirates. Their society was built on two paradoxes. First, why did pirate crews, composed of outlaws, create a system for distributing plunder that was radically fairer than that of the Royal Navy, where officers took almost everything? On a pirate ship, the captain received just 2 shares of the loot compared to a common sailor's single share. We will uncover the answer to this economic paradox in the 4th section. Second, what explains their astonishing combat effectiveness? Logic suggests that a gang of selfish criminals should have collapsed into chaos at the first sign of danger. The secret to their war machine will be revealed in the climax, in the 8th section. The answers to these questions reveal them not as primitive robbers, but as the architects of a complex social system. Right now, you probably picture pirates as the embodiment of chaos, rum, a lust for gold, and mindless cruelty. That part of the image is true, but it hides something far more complex. By the end of this video, your view of pirates will change forever. Instead of chaotic bandits, you will see pioneers of a brutal form of self-governance, born from a rebellion against tyranny. You will understand that these men didn't just plunder. They built an alternative society on their ships, complete with its own laws, elections, and even a social insurance system. Their society didn't operate like a pyramid of power, but like a raging river. On the surface, chaos and destruction. But within, a powerful, unified current, guided by 2 invisible banks, shared greed and shared fear. Our investigation will proceed through 3 key points. In just 4 minutes, we will shatter the central myth of the pirate captain. You will learn who truly ran the ship and why it was not a dictatorship, but a democracy at gunpoint. 12 minutes in, you will delve into the pirate's moral code. You will learn about the 3 mortal sins for which crewmates would condemn their brother to a punishment worse than a swift death. And at 19 minutes, we will assemble all the pieces of the puzzle. We will reveal how this internal code became their most formidable weapon in a war against the entire world, transforming a rabble into an empire of fear. The myth of the dictator captain crumbles under the weight of one fact: he could be fired. How was a ship managed by a leader on probation? At first, it seems simple. The crew elected the most experienced fighter and navigator. Elections were held after a mutiny or the death of the previous captain. But this wasn't a popularity contest. It was a job hiring. The captain's absolute authority was active only in 2 brief windows, during a chase and in the heat of a boarding. In peacetime, all decisions, from the ship's course to the division of provisions, were made by a council. The captain was a tool, a weapon in the hands of the crew, and this explains why the real power on the ship belonged not to the man at the helm. How did dozens of armed egoists agree on a target to attack without bloodshed? The answer was revolutionary for its time: a direct vote. By the principle of 1 pirate, 1 vote, all key issues were decided. The cabin boy's opinion carried as much weight as the boatswain's. But this system wasn't just a convenient mechanism. It was a conscious political declaration. Most pirates were former merchant sailors, powerless slaves to their captains. Their democracy was a furious reaction to the tyranny they had endured. The vote acted as a collective breath before battle. Each pirate infused the common resolve with his own will, sealing the contract with blood. But this political bond was only half the story. What stopped the strongest from taking all the gold for themselves during the division of spoils? The answer lay in their economic code, the no prey, no pay contract. Shares were agreed upon in advance. The captain received 2 shares, the carpenter or surgeon 1.5, and a common sailor 1. The contrast with the civilized world was staggering. On Bartholomew Roberts's ship, the captain earned only twice as much as a sailor. In the Royal Navy, an admiral could take thousands of times more. Pirates were shareholders in a bloody enterprise. Moreover, the code included a social insurance system. Compensation for losing a right arm could be as high as 600 pieces of 8, the equivalent of 6 years' salary for an ordinary seaman. But what happened when one of the brethren decided to betray this financial trust? An elected leader, direct democracy, a fair economy, social security. On paper, this society looks almost ideal. So why did these men go down in history as monsters? Because this system was incredibly fragile. It was held together solely by mutual trust and the voluntary submission of the majority. One traitor, one man hiding a share of gold, one coward in battle, and the entire ship would go down. This utopia was constantly on the verge of collapse due to the nature of its citizens. Therefore, its protection required draconian laws. Pirate justice was sustained not by goodwill, but by a blood-chilling fear of punishment. This fear was enshrined in 3 unbreakable rules. The first unforgivable sin was stealing from a comrade. The second was desertion in battle. The third was secretly bringing a woman aboard. These 3 prohibitions were not moral principles, but systemic safeguards. Theft destroyed the economic contract. Cowardice undermined the war machine. And a woman on board was seen as a catalyst for conflict, destroying social cohesion. These rules were like the 3 legs of a simple stool. Remove one, and the entire fragile structure of their society would instantly collapse. That is why the punishment was so brutal. But who had the right to accuse, judge, and sentence on a ship where every man was a law unto himself? When a pirate was accused of a crime, what followed was not mob justice, but a formal procedure. The role of investigator and judge was played by the quartermaster. He was more than just a supply officer. He was the most respected veteran, elected by the crew to protect its interests. But the real power did not belong to him. The entire crew would assemble on the quarterdeck. The accuser and the accused presented their evidence. The quartermaster maintained order, and then something unthinkable on any other vessel in the world occurred. The verdict was delivered by a general vote. The will of the collective was the supreme law. This was the peak of pirate democracy, and simultaneously the most terrifying moment for the accused. And if you were found guilty by your own brethren, you faced a punishment many considered worse than a swift death. The ultimate punishment was marooning, being left on a deserted island. The purpose of this ritual was not death itself, but a lesson for the survivors. The traitor was given a kit, a flask of water, a pistol, a single bullet, and a pinch of powder. This wasn't a chance to survive, but a deliberate choice the crew left for the condemned, a slow agony of thirst or instant suicide. Marooning was less a punishment for one man and more a psychological torture, and a performance for everyone else. The image of a comrade abandoned on a desolate shore would haunt the crew in their nightmares, ensuring no one else would dare break the code. This complex internal system was created for one purpose: maximum external effectiveness. Democracy ensured unquestioning loyalty in battle. A fair economy provided the highest motivation, and brutal punishments guaranteed iron discipline. The pirate code was not a shield to protect them from each other, but a sword aimed at the entire world. It transformed a rabble of fugitives into a cohesive, motivated, and utterly ruthless fighting unit, more effective than regular naval ships. In the next section, we will delve into the economic engine of this machine and understand why every pirate was willing to die for his share. The figure is shocking. The captain receives only twice as much as a sailor. How could such an egalitarian business model thrive in an era when the entire global economy was built on maximum exploitation? The answer lies in the no-prey, no-pay contract. This wasn't a salary. It was a share in the enterprise. If a raid failed, no one got anything. Every crew member became a shareholder, risking his life for the common profit. On merchant ships, sailors were hired labor. The success of an expedition had little effect on their income, so they risked their lives under duress. A pirate's motivation was like a predator's. Either he catches his prey, or he starves. This created a crew where everyone was personally invested in success. But what if you were wounded in that fight and could no longer battle? Would your business partners simply throw you overboard? In a world where a man's value was determined by his combat readiness, the pirate code introduced a surprising humanism. Bartholomew Roberts's code contained a clear tariff schedule: 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 700 for the left, 100 for an eye. But here's the hidden detail. These compensations were paid out from the total plunder before it was divided into shares. Caring for a wounded comrade was a collective priority that superseded everyone's personal gain. This made the pirate brotherhood real. You went into battle knowing that even if you were maimed, the crew would take care of you. This removed a huge psychological barrier and allowed them to fight even more fiercely. But what happened when this fundamental trust was violated by a single stolen coin? Picture the scene. After a battle, during the division of plunder, a pirate secretly pockets a gold coin. It seems trivial, but a single rumor of theft would sweep across the deck faster than fire, instantly poisoning the ship's atmosphere. Yesterday's brothers would begin to suspect one another. The economic system, built on shared ownership and trust, would cease to function. The crew would turn into a bucket of crabs. A single stolen coin was not just a theft. It was a systemic threat. It triggered a chain reaction of mistrust that could destroy the entire crew from within. That is why the reaction was so swift and brutal. The punishment had to be exemplary to heal the system. And this led directly to a formal trial where the survival of the entire ship was at stake. Herein lies the central paradox of the pirate economy. On one hand, unprecedented fairness and social security. On the other, the death penalty for the slightest offense. At first glance, this is a contradiction, but in reality, it's a symbiosis. A fair economy based on trust was incredibly vulnerable. The greater the trust, the more devastating its breach. Therefore, the system required an absolutely merciless defense. Their justice demanded their cruelty. One could not exist without the other. They were two sides of the same coin. And this mechanism was enshrined. 3 pragmatic laws we will now examine. Stealing from a merchant was an act of valor. Stealing a copper coin from a bunkmate was a mortal sin. This paradox reveals the essence of their pragmatic ethics. The first prohibition, found in almost every pirate code, was, "Do not steal from a crew member." This wasn't about morality, it was about mathematics. This law protected the ship's economic engine, the no-prey, no-pay contract. If the crew cannot trust each other with the security of their shares, the system collapses. The brotherhood vanishes. What remains is a collection of individuals guarding their purses. Therefore, the punishment, often the slitting of the nose and ears, was brutal not because of the value of what was stolen. It was treason in their floating republic. But there was a betrayal even worse, committed not in the silence of the hold, but in the roar of a boarding. The second mortal sin, desertion in battle. In the heat of a boarding, as the clash of steel drowns out the screams, one pirate hides behind a mast. To his comrades, this is not a show of weakness, but a breach of the military contract. A pirate attack was a tactical operation, a living shield wall. One man's cowardice created a gap through which death could reach everyone. Therefore, punishment was inevitable. Every man went into battle with absolute certainty. The man beside him would fight to the end, because the punishment from his own crew was more terrifying than an enemy's bullet. This made them predictable and deadly. But the strangest prohibition concerned not gold or steel, but a threat they considered most dangerous to their brotherhood. The third sin, secretly bringing a woman on board. On a ship full of men who had rejected all norms, this ban seems illogical. It was not superstition. The reason was cold and pragmatic. A woman on a ship with 100 men was seen as a catalyst for chaos, an inevitable source of jealousy, duels, and the splitting of the crew into warring factions. It was an unmanageable risk capable of destroying the entire enterprise. The code of Bartholomew Roberts stated it clearly. The guilty party would be executed. This prohibition best illustrates their obsession with internal order. They gave up one of life's principal pleasures for the stability of the system that fed them. theft, cowardice, women. These three prohibitions were not a random set of rules. They precisely targeted the three main vulnerabilities of their society: economic, military, and social. These were not laws, but the three load-bearing pillars that supported their fragile world. Remove one, and the entire structure would immediately collapse. Without trust, there was no economy. Without discipline, there were no victories. Without unity, there was no crew. Therefore, protecting these pillars was not a matter of morality, but of survival. They were the foundation for the merciless judicial machine we are about to see in action. When the cry, "Thief!" rang out on deck, the unthinkable happened. Instead of an instant knife fight, the drunken band of killers froze. A dead silence fell. Why did anarchy suddenly give way to discipline? Because the pirate codes forbade mob justice. Any accusation triggered a formal procedure, a self-preservation mechanism, but the man who stepped into the center of the deck was not the captain. It was the quartermaster, the crew's elected protector. In that moment, the captain's military authority evaporated. He became a spectator. Justice was separate from command, and this balance of power was the foundation of their brutal democracy. How did a band of illiterate cutthroats conduct a trial? The quarterdeck was transformed into a courtroom. The quartermaster read the charges and presented witnesses. But this was not a show trial with a foregone conclusion. The accused was given the right to a final word and could call his own witnesses. It was a crude semblance of a trial by jury, where every pirate on deck was a judge. Then came the moment of truth. The verdict was delivered not by a secret ballot, but openly, by a show of cutlasses. The will of the majority was absolute and could not be appealed. The brotherhood of arms transformed into a collective executioner, and if that will demanded blood, the punishment was swift and creatively cruel. But why were ritual punishments necessary? Why not just a bullet to the back of the head? Flogging with the cat-o'-nine-tails or keel-hauling were not just for deterrence. They were theater of terror, propaganda aimed at the crew itself. The punishment had to become a scar on everyone's memory, an eternal reminder that the code would defend itself with inhuman cruelty. The sentence was often carried out by the entire crew. Each man delivered a lash. This made everyone complicit, binding the crew together through shared blood. It was a ritual of purification, but it was reserved only for those who could still be corrected. This system of justice seems complete. It punished the offense and restored order. But physical punishment dealt with the crime, not the betrayal. Cowardice in battle or colluding with the enemy was not a violation of a rule, but an existential threat. It destroyed trust, the pirate's only capital. Simply killing a traitor was not enough. He had to be symbolically erased from their world. Therefore, the most terrible punishment was not physical, but metaphysical. It was not about pain, but about total isolation. It was a ritual of expulsion from the brotherhood, from the world of the living, and the name of this ultimate penalty became legendary. White sand, palm trees, turquoise water. For a modern person, this is the image of a dream, an escape from civilization. For a pirate of the Golden Age, there was no fate more terrifying. Marooning, being left on a deserted island, was the punishment for the gravest crimes: mutiny or desertion. This was not exile, but a carefully planned, delayed execution. Its purpose was to make a person slowly go mad from loneliness. It was the death of the spirit, followed only then by the body. The act of leaving a comrade on the shore was a grim ritual for the entire crew. But the most diabolical part of this ritual was not what the condemned was deprived of, but what he was left with. If you want a man to die, why give him a weapon? The traitor was handed a devil's kit: a flask of water, some powder, and a pistol loaded with a single bullet. At first glance, this seems like an act of mercy, but the logic was monstrous. The water was not for survival, but to prolong the agony for a few more days. The powder was to light a signal fire that would feed a false hope of rescue, and the pistol with one bullet was not a gift, but an ultimatum, a choice between a slow death and suicide. The crew didn't just kill the traitor, they forced him to become his own executioner. The bullet in the pistol was not just a piece of lead, but a final message from the crew, a sign of their ultimate contempt. Against all odds, there were men who survived being marooned. The most famous, Alexander Selkirk, the prototype for Robinson Crusoe, spent 4 years and 4 months in solitude. Such cases were statistical anomalies. If a survivor was picked up by another pirate ship, his resilience commanded respect. But what if it was a naval warship? To the authorities, he was still a pirate. He faced shackles, a trial, and a guaranteed trip to the gallows. Often, a survivor, after months of hell on an island, would have preferred to die there. The story of a survivor didn't inspire hope. It built the pirates' reputation. It proved that even their outcasts were supermen. This entire system served one primary goal. Marooning is an act of extreme separation. So how could it unite a crew? The terror of such a prospect was the best guarantee of discipline, but its true power lay in its effect on those who remained on the ship. Every time the crew marooned one of their own, they all went through a traumatic ritual together. It was a collective decision to leave a brother to a slow death. As the ship sailed away, the crew would silently watch the shore. This shared experience created a bond stronger than any oath, sealed by common sin and common fear. It worked like tempering steel. The red-hot metal of the crew was plunged into the icy water of trauma, making the blade unbreakable. In 2 minutes, you will learn how this internal cruelty became their main weapon against entire nations. We have uncovered the internal mechanism of a pirate ship, but how did this brutal democracy give rise to such an effective war machine? The answer explains their astonishing combat effectiveness. The pirate code was their primary asymmetric weapon. When a pirate went into battle, he was a shareholder fighting for his fortune. A sailor on a merchant vessel was a hired hand, with a meager salary who had no intention of dying for someone else's cargo. On Bartholomew Roberts's ship, the captain received only 2 shares to a sailor's 1. In the Royal Navy, the prize money gap between an admiral and a sailor could be thousands to 1. The code turned the ship into a perfect predator, where every man was lethally motivated, but motivation was only half of their weapon. The other half was even more terrifying. Why were pirates so obsessed with building their brand? The black flag? Fearsome names? Terrifying stories? It wasn't bravado. It was cold calculation. Their reputation was a weapon of mass destruction. But it was built not on rumors of how they treated their enemies, but on how they treated their own. Stories of marooning and trials on the quarterdeck spread to every port. A merchant captain understood. If they do this to their brothers, what will they do to outsiders? The black flag was not just a symbol. It was a promise that the code was in effect on board. This meant the crew would fight as a single organism to the last drop of blood, because punishment from their own was more fearsome than death. And one man perfected this system. Black Bart Roberts captured over 400 ships, yet he was a teetotaler and hated gambling. How did the most un-pirate-like pirate become the most successful? His detailed 11-article code was not just a tool of suppression, but the best recruitment tool. Sailors from captured vessels, seeing the order, fairness, and potential profit, defected to his side in droves. Life under his code was dangerous, but often freer and more lucrative than the slave labor they had fled. Roberts's code turned yesterday's enemies into loyal allies, creating a self-replicating mechanism for success. His code was viral. Here we see the final paradox. The code was an internal tool, created to keep a band of outcasts from killing each other. But when this model was replicated on hundreds of ships, it ceased to be an internal matter. It became an alternative system of social organization, a shadow state with its own laws, economy, and army. At the peak of the Golden Age, up to 5,000 men lived by these rules. The code was not just a set of bylaws. It was a revolutionary, portable, and lethally effective social technology. It transformed the chaos of individual rebellion into the order of collective war. But what was it? The birth of a new, brutal order, or the apex of wild, untamed freedom? The answer is in the finale. Let's mentally return to the deck where our journey began. We started with a paradox, a captain who feared his own crew. From that starting point, we discovered a floating republic where the principle of one pirate, one vote reigned. We dissected their revolutionary no-prey, no-pay economy and a first-of-its-kind social insurance system. We witnessed their brutal yet democratic trials. And finally, we saw how this entire internal system became their main external weapon. Every element was not an accident, but a vital part of the whole. Without democracy, there would be no motivation. Without a fair economy, no unity. Without a brutal court, no trust. And without trust, they would have been just a gang, not a brotherhood. Now we are ready to answer the questions posed at the very beginning. So why did a band of sea robbers have laws and systems of wealth distribution that seem fairer to us than those of the civilized nations of their time? Because their system was not inherited. It was not shackled by centuries of tradition, aristocratic privilege, and class hierarchy. It was created from scratch under desperate circumstances by fugitives from the tyranny of the merchant and naval fleets. It was an extreme social experiment. The only measures of their society's success were survival and profit. Any rule that did not lead to maximum efficiency and cohesion was discarded. Brutal, merciless pragmatism defeated tradition. Justice was not the goal, but the tool. It was the most effective way to make desperate men work together. How did outcasts who rejected all of society's laws manage to create their own, even stricter order and force each other to obey it? They were able to do it precisely because they were outcasts. Cut off from the rest of the world, hunted by all nations, they could trust no one but each other. Trust became their most valuable and scarcest resource, and the entire pirate code was nothing more than a machine for manufacturing that trust. This machine ran on two types of fuel. The first was greed. The promise of a fair and enormous share of the plunder made everyone row in the same direction. The second was fear. The inevitable and brutal punishment for betrayal made violating trust mortally dangerous. It was a bloody but perfectly functioning machine, their only way to survive. Ultimately, it all comes down to one question. What was the pirate code really? Was it a progressive, albeit bloody, model for a new society? A system built on democracy, equality of opportunity, and meritocracy, where the only value was efficiency. A model based on the principles of a brutal order. Or was it the ultimate expression of anarchy? An absolute rejection of all external authorities, kings, nations, gods. A world where the only law was the will of free individuals who had sealed a temporary pact. The embodiment of wild freedom. Order or freedom. A proto-state or an anti-state. Write one of the two phrases in the comments. I'm very interested to see which way you lean.